Christian Spirituality in the Catholic Tradition, Part 16. The first name on the list of Jesuit writers of the 17th century is that of Saint Alphonsus Rodriguez, died 1617, a humble coadjutor brother who seems to go directly contrary to the spirituality endorsed by Aqua Viva in the Society of Jesus. Having been refused admittance to the society on 2 occasions, he was finally accepted by Cordeses, the provincial of Aragon. Alphonsus entered as a widower and spent his entire religious life as a porter at the Jesuit college in Palma de Mallorca. At the request of his superiors, he left an autobiography of his spiritual life, which was one of the many trials, severe temptations, and the highest degree of mystical prayer. Most of his writings were not published until the 19th century, and for that reason Alphonsus did not enjoy the popularity that he deserves. He was a mystic who reached the heights of contemplative prayer on the path of humility, total resignation to God, and literal obedience. Totally different from Saint Alphonsus and much better known is Alphonsus Rodriguez, died 1616, Jesuit novice master at Andalucia, whose lengthy work was published under the title Ejercicio de la Perfección y las Virtudes Cristianas. Rodriguez was over 70 years of age when the book was compiled for the spiritual conferences he had given to Jesuit novices. They are almost exclusively ascetical and moral in tone. But since the material concerns the formation of novices, it seems unfair to accuse Rodriguez of being anti-mystical simply because he did not spend much time on mystical topics. Yet Rodriguez seems to make too wide a distinction between ascetical and discursive prayer and mystical prayer, to the point that he seems to see mystical contemplation as something extraordinary, and he does not make allowance for any kind of transitional prayer between discursive and mystical prayer. His practice of Christian perfection was widely distributed. Once it was translated into French, it was adopted by many religious institutes as obligatory spiritual reading, although in modern times it has fallen into disuse because of its legalistic morality and extreme asceticism. Louis de la Puente, 1624, began his career as a writer when he was over 50 years of age, beginning with a 2-volume study entitled Meditations on the Mysteries of Our Holy Faith. From the days of his tertianship in the society, he was greatly influenced by Baltasar Alvarez, and came to the end of his life he wrote a biography of Alvarez. Although his teaching is almost entirely restricted to ascetical grades of prayer, he helped break down the prejudice against mystical prayer and the mystical state. Logically, Lewis advocates the use of the spiritual exercises, and he admits that although mystical prayer is a special gift from God, it is usually given to those who have been faithful to the practice of meditation and recollection on the divine mysteries. He gives a variety of names to contemplative prayer: prayer of the presence of God, prayer of repose, prayer of silence, prayer of interior recollection. But in describing contemplation, de la Puente is in the orthodox tradition of the great teachers. Contemplation by a simple gaze, regards the sovereign truth, admires its greatness, and delights in it. Of all the Jesuit authors of this period, however, Alvarez de Paz was the first to make a complete synthesis of ascetical and mystical theology. Other writers had composed treatises that touched upon both the ascetical and mystical phases of the spiritual life, but they were books of spiritual direction rather than books of spiritual theology. Alvarez de Paz labored in Peru, where he wrote his books in Latin and then had them published in France, likely through fear of the Spanish Inquisition. The titles of his 3 published volumes indicate the vastness of the theological project that he had envisioned. De Vita Spirituale e Usque Perfectione, 1608. De Exterminatione Mali et Promotione Boni, 1613, and De Inquisitione Pacis Sive Studio Orationis, 1617. He also intended to write a volume on the active life of the apostolate, but he never finished it. The author defines the spiritual life as the life of sanctifying grace, which admits of various degrees, and then he explains how the individual soul, whether the active or the contemplative life, can strive to the perfection of the spiritual life by an ever-increasing charity. He treats at some length the avoidance of sin, and the importance of cultivating humility, chastity, poverty, and obedience, and the practice of mortification. Alvarez de Paz divides mental prayer into 4 basic types: discursive, meditation, affective prayer, inchoate contemplation, and perfect compilation. He provides something that others before him had failed to do, namely, a form of prayer that would serve as a transition between the ascetical prayer and the mystical prayer. He can also be credited with introducing a classification that is original, affective prayer, and the name has just been preserved by succeeding writers. He is careful to insist, however, that just as discursive prayer cannot be exclusively the work of the intellect, which would turn prayer into study, so affective prayer is not exclusively an activity of the affections. It is simply a question that predominates in the particular type of prayer, but man must both use intellect and affections in the form of prayer. The aim of prayer is to increase charity, and therefore effective prayer is a more pure form of prayer than discursive prayer. It may be practiced in 3 ways: by repeated acts of love made under the impulse of grace, by a simple, pure act of love in the presence of God, and by a special operation of God on the soul, inchoate contemplation. Perfect contemplation, on the other hand, is of 2 kinds. First, the extraordinary gifts which are sometimes given to the soul by God as mystical phenomena, raptures, visions, and so forth. And secondly, a simple knowledge of God, affected by the gift of wisdom, which elevates the soul and suspends the operations of its member faculties and places it in a state of admiration, joy, and ardent love. Souls may desire contemplation and even humbly request it of God because it is the most efficacious way of attaining perfection. With this, we conclude our survey of Spanish spirituality, and although we have discussed only a few of the spiritual writers who are the glory of Spain's golden age, We must note that no other Catholic nation has contributed so much to the spiritual theology. The Spain that gave the Church St. Teresa de Avila, St. John of the Cross, and St. Ignatius Loyola also produced founders of apostolic orders, countless missionaries to Latin America and the Orient, and, in recent times, one of the most flourishing institutes of consecrated life, Opus Dei. Italian spirituality. While Spanish spirituality was from the outset psychological in its approach and after the Golden Age tended to become academic and speculative, Italian spirituality in the 16th and 17th centuries was practical and tended towards the cultivation of a reforming spirit. Even great mystics like the Carmelite Saint Magdalene of Pazzi and the Dominican Saint Catherine de' Ricci were occupied to a great extent with the reform of the Church. The reason for this was the alarming inroads made by the pagan customs of the Renaissance throughout the whole of Italy, and spiritual writers in the tradition of Savonarola were soon demanding that steps be taken to restore both the clergy and the laity to an authentic Christian life. The effort was further complicated by the fact that the fear of the Protestant revolt led to the establishment of the Inquisition, and that even the advocates of reform had to exercise great caution. The Italians were more afraid of heresy than they were of worldliness and sensuality. One of the prime movers of the Italian reaction against the pagan influence of the Renaissance was the Dominican John Baptist di Crema, a renowned preacher, director of souls, and a spiritual writer. After his death in 1552, his works were placed on the index by an Italian Inquisition, and it was not until 1900 that they were removed. His spirituality was one which placed great emphasis on personal effort, cooperation with grace, and eradication of vice. Because of his insistence on voluntary effort and his inadequate treatment of the doctrine of pure love, some critics claim to find the taint of semi-Pelagianism in his doctrine. Nevertheless, the movement which he began was to bear fruit in several areas. The emergence of the clerics regular as a new form of religious life, and the publication of the Spiritual Combat, attributed to Lawrence Scupoli. John Baptist da Crema had been the spiritual director of some very holy people, among them St. Cajetan, founder of the Theatines, and St. Anthony Zaccaria, the founder of the Barnabites. Like St. Ignatius, who had come to Rome in 1537, these men were convinced that the only way to reform the clergy was by way of example and by personal influence on small groups. As a result, the clerics regular were founded precisely as a vehicle for the reformation of the clergy. The clerics regular did not live a monastic style of life, nor did they observe poverty in the manner proper to the mendicants. Rather, they emphasized interior poverty and detachment from the goods of the world. Their practice of prayer was free and simple, unlike the methodical prayer of the Ignatian exercises, although they did follow the system of self-combat advocated by St. Ignatius. In this period of reform, Italy produced numerous saints and a large number of new religious institutes, dedicated either to the reform of the Church or the apostolate of the works of mercy. Thus, we may mention St. Robert Bellarmine, St. Philip Neri, founder of the Oratorians, St. Charles Borromeo, founder of the Oblates, Saint Cajetan, founder of the Theatines, Saint Angela Merici, founder of the Ursulines, Saint Anthony Zaccaria, founder of the Barnabites, Saint Camillus, founder of the Fathers of a Good Death, and so forth. In spite of the reforming spirit of Italian spirituality, it never became harsh or severe. It was always a spirituality of interior mortification, cultivation of divine love, tenderness, and joy, as was manifested in the lives of the saints that it produced. The most influential spiritual literature of the period was The Spiritual Combat, the work of the Theatine, Lawrence Scupoli. Reflecting as it does a period of church reform and renewal, The Spiritual Combat aims primarily at conversion from sin and the cultivation of an interior life. It states as a fundamental principle that the spiritual life does not consist essentially in external practices, but in the knowledge and love of God. Christian perfection is primarily interior, and therefore it demands death to self and complete submission to God through love and obedience. Again and again it stresses the pure love of God and a desire for His glory as the proper motives for Christian living, although fear of hell and a desire for heaven may be good motives for beginners. Considering man's sinful state, perfection can be achieved only by constant warfare against self. The chief weapons in this spiritual combat are distrust of self, of ourselves we can do nothing, trust in God, in Him we can do all things, and proper use of our faculties of body and soul, and the practice of prayer. The spiritual combat, as the name indicates, is certainly primarily with the proper use of our faculties and powers, and to this end it treats in particular of the various faculties, offers advice on how to control them, and urge constant custody. Nevertheless, there is no attempt to smother the senses or to imply that they are necessary sources of evil and sin. Rather, it is a question of learning how to reach God through the proper use of the senses, much as was explained by St. Ignatius in his Exercises. As regards the practice of prayer, we find none of the detailed explanations that characterize Spanish spirituality. The 3 styles of prayer are recommended, and all of them are ascetical: meditation, especially on the passion and death of Christ, communion with God by frequently recollecting oneself in His presence and making use of ejaculations or short prayers, and examination of conscience, which is not prayer in the strict sense of the word, although it may lead to prayer. There is, finally, the suggestion to receive communion as frequently as possible, and then that it is not possible to practice communion of desire or spiritual communion. 2 renowned mystics of the period also exercised a social and reforming mission, very similar to that of St. Catherine of Siena. The first, a Carmelite named St. Magdalene of Pazzi, was an ecstatic who gifted with phenomenal mystical gifts. Her written works were all dictated while in ecstasy, and she used the service of 6 secretaries who were hard-pressed to copy down the torrent of words that she expressed. Her works can be divided under 5 headings: contemplations on the mysteries of faith and the life of Christ, the religious life and the virtues, commentaries on sacred scripture, contemplations on the divine perfection, and exclamations similar to those composed by St. Teresa of Avila. Like St. Magdalene, St. Catherine de' Ricci Dominican, was a mystic totally dedicated to the reform of the Church, but unlike Magdalene, she carried on her apostolates by means of letters addressed to the persons concerned. In spite of her zeal for the reform of the Church and her intense suffering on receiving the stigmata of the Lord's Passion, her biography, Serafino Razzi, relates that God flooded Catherine's soul with indescribable joy. Other mystics of the time manifested the same concern for the reform of the Church in similar to mystical phenomena. For example, the Dominican tertiary Blessed Osana of Mantua and the Poor Clare Blessed Battista Verani. The happiness of the Italian mystic is especially noteworthy in St. Philip Neri, died 1595, who had been called the loving saint par excellence. He is in many ways a forerunner of the spirit of St. Francis de Sales, for he maintained that the spirit of joy wins Christian perfection more easily than does the spirit of sadness. Nevertheless, he also insisted on the importance of interior mortification and, with St. Charles Borromeo, the practice of prayer. Indeed, he maintained that mortification is one of the best preparations for the practice of prayer. In periods of dryness, his advice was the same as that of St. Teresa of Avila. Under no circumstances should one abandon the practice of prayer. If a book were used, St. Philip advocated that one should read until devotion is aroused and then close the book and begin to pray. Prayer, said St. Philip, is in the supernatural order what speech is into the natural order. St. Philip Neri dedicated himself as often as possible to the care of the sick. He even maintained that nursing the sick is a short path to perfection. His biographer, Cardinal Capicilatro, says of him, "He made himself the master of a mild, sweet, tender, compassionate asceticism. Throughout his life, hardly 2 or 3 instances of moderate severity are to be met with, and, on the contrary, an infinite sweetness of charity towards one's neighbor is seen at every step." One characteristic of Italian spirituality at this period is the theme of divine love. Historically, it can be traced back to St. Catherine of Genoa, died in 1510, the foundress of Italian hospitals. One of her disciples, Ettore Vernazza, founded a religious group under the title Oratorio del Divino Amore, and it quickly spread throughout Italy. The writings of St. Catherine of Genoa were edited by Ettore Vernazza and Cataneo Marabotti, St. Catherine's confessor, in 1530, and then in 1548 Battista Vernazza composed the dialogues, which were added to St. Catherine's life and treatise on purgatory in the edition of 1551. Although not the work of St. Catherine herself, the dialogues do faithfully reflect her teaching on divine love. The importance of the dialogues is that they correspond with the mystical experiences of several saints of the time. They propose a high degree of love of God which is free from self-interest, and they place as a condition for the attainment of this perfect love the expression of love of neighbor. The devotion of divine love led to a proliferation of companies, a title that was used by numerous new institutes dedicated to the apostolate of the corporal works of mercy in various cities of Italy. Saint Francis de Sales. Saint Francis de Sales forms a school of spirituality by himself alone. He is its beginning, its develop, and its sum total. Philip Hughes states that it is in Francis de Sales that the French Renaissance is baptized and humanism becomes devout. He's also a bridge between the Renaissance and the modern period and has been one of the strongest single influences on spirituality from the 17th century to the present day. Born at Savoy in 1567, Francis de Sales studied under the Jesuits at Paris and then went on to Padua, where he received his doctorate in civil and canon law. Ordained to the priesthood in December of 1593, he was named provost of the chapter of Geneva, an office second only to that of the bishop. Immediately he dedicated himself with great vigor to the evangelization of the Calvinists, and he succeeded so well that he was named coadjutor of the Bishop of Geneva. Then, on December 8, 1602, he was consecrated Bishop of Geneva. Until his death in 1622, he dedicated himself to preaching, spiritual writing, and the direction of souls, as well as the administration of his diocese. Together with Saint Jane Francis de Chantal, he founded the Religious Institute of the Visitation of the Blessed Virgin, a semi-cloistered community for young women and widows. In 1887, Pope Pius IX declared St. Francis de Sales a Doctor of the Church, the first time this honor was bestowed on a Frenchman. From his earliest years, St. Francis de Sales was strongly attracted to the things of God, and various incidents of his life that give every indication that his call to the clerical life was an immediate divine vocation. Michael de la Bedoyere says that Francis de Sales is the greatest of all the saints, at least for modern times. And I base this conviction on the sense I had all the time that here was a human being of our period of Western history who, naturally, instinctively, and as well as supernaturally, reflected almost directly the character and the way of Christ our Lord. The doctrine taught by St. Francis de Sales was not new, but he did present spiritual teaching in an original manner, and he deserves credit for removing Christian spirituality from the monastic framework in which it had been confined for many centuries. Trained as he was by the Jesuits, St. Francis was clearly Ignatian in his spiritual practices, but in his theology he is an Augustinian with a realism and optimism of a Thomist. Very likely he was familiar with the writings of the Flemish school, St. Catherine of Siena, for whom he had a great love, St. Catherine of Genoa, St. Philip Neri, and numerous writers of the Spanish school, especially St. Teresa of Avila, St. John the Cross, St. Louis of Granada, John of Avila, and Garcia de Cisneros. The Spiritual Combat was a favorite meditation book since his days at Padua. In Paris he had contacts with the Capuchin, Richard Beaucousin, and Berulli, the Carmelite nuns, and Madame Acari. The critical editions of the work of St. Francis de Sales comprises 27 volumes, of which 12 volumes contain his letters. The rest of the edition contains the defense of the standard of the Holy Cross, introduction to the devout life, treatise on the love of God, spiritual interviews, his controversies, and 4 volumes of sermons. but for our purpose it will suffice to summarize the doctrine contained in the introduction to the devout life. The introduction to the devout life first appeared in 1609, and a final edition, made by St. Francis himself, was published in 1619. The book was written precisely for the laity, and perhaps St. Francis de Sales was the first writer to compose a treatise of lay spirituality. As he had done it in his preface, those who have written previously on the spiritual life have done so for the instruction of persons who had given up association with the Word, or they have taught a spirituality that would lead persons to do so. The intention of St. Francis, however, is to give spiritual instruction to those who remain in the world, in their professions and in their families, and falsely believe that it is impossible for them to strive for the devout life. What does St. Francis understand about the devout life, or true devotion? First of all, it does not consist in any kind of extraordinary grace or favor, and St. Francis states this quite emphatically. There are certain things which many people esteem as virtue, and they are not that at all. I refer to ecstasies, raptures, and insensibilities, impassibilities, deific unions, elevations, transformation, and other similar perfections discussed in certain books which promise to raise the soul to a purely intellectual contemplation, to the essential application of the spirit and a supereminent life. These perfections are not zeros, rather they are rewards that God gives for virtues, or small samples of the delights of the future way. Nevertheless, one should not aspire to such graces because they are in no way necessary for loving and serving God well, which should be our only aim. Secondly, true devotion does not consist in any particular spiritual exercise. I hear nothing but perfections, and yet I see very few people who practice them. Some place their virtue in austerity, others in abstemiousness, in eating, almsgiving, others in frequenting the sacraments of penance and the Eucharist, another group in prayer, either vocal or mental, still another in a certain sort of passive and supereminent contemplation. Others are those gratuitously given extraordinary graces. And all of them are mistaken. Taken the effects for its causes, the brook for the spring, the branches for the root, the necessary for the principle, often for the shadow of the substance. For me, I neither know nor have experienced any other Christian perfection than that of loving God with all our heart and our neighbor as ourselves. Every other perfection without this one is a false perception. True devotion, for which St. Francis de Sales is the same as Christian perfection, is the fulfillment of the twofold precept of charity enunciated by Christ. In the introduction to the devout life, he gives a detailed exposition which is similar to the definition of devotion according to Louis of Granada. True living devotion, philothea, presupposes the love of God. Indeed, it is nothing else but true love of God, but just not in any kind of love, insofar as his divine love beautifies our soul. It is called grace and makes us pleasing to the divine majesty. Insofar as it gives us the power to do good, it is called charity, but when it reaches a degree of perfection in which it not only makes us do good, but makes us do it carefully, frequently, and promptly, then it is called devotion. Although he mentions the good works that flow from true devotion, St. Francis is insistent that the devout life is essentially an interior life. Moreover, the devout life will be lived differently by persons in different vocations or professions. All, therefore, should seek the perfection of the devout life, but each one in accordance with his personal strength and the duties of his state of life. Immediately after stressing the universal call of all Christians to perfection, St. Francis de Sales insists on the need for a spiritual director. He admits that a good director is hard to find, and he states that he must be a man of charity, learning, and prudence. He also warns that spiritual direction must never impede the working of the Holy Spirit or be an obstacle to the freedom of the soul. For all persons who are not called by the same road to perfection, this, of course, is the same advice that was offered by St. Teresa of Avila and St. John of the Cross. The first task facing the soul is purgation from sin, and here St. Francis follows the teaching of St. Ignatius Loyola, proposing meditation on the last ends and a general confession. Then there must be a complete renunciation of all attachment to sin, without which there can be no lasting conversion and no progress in perfection. To achieve this second and more profound purgation, it is necessary to avoid all occasions of sin, and to be involved in worldly affairs only when necessity requires and not out of love for created things. Although the soul must sometimes learn to live with its own perfections and weaknesses, it should never willingly accept the faults that proceed from temperament or habit. To grow in virtue, says St. Francis, we must overcome even our indeliberate faults. In the second part of the introduction, St. Francis proposes a daily schedule of spiritual exercises in which the practice of mental prayer holds a central position. Basically, they are the same spiritual exercises as listed in the Spiritual Combat, and followed by the cleric's regular: daily mental prayer, morning and evening prayers, examination of conscience, weekly confession and frequent communion, spiritual reading, and the practice of interior recollection. The Salesian method of mental prayer is simple, clear, and brief. In many respects it resembles the former prayer taught by Louis of Granada, St. Ignatius Loyola, and the Spiritual Combat. At the very outset, following the teachings of St. Bernard, St. Teresa of Avila, and St. John of the Cross, St. Francis de Sales emphasizes the importance of meditation on the life of Christ. The body of the meditation proper consists in the application of the intellect and the will to move the subject matter. Calmly and without haste, the mind should meditate on the various aspects of the mystery proposed for consideration. As soon as it finds inspiration and delight in any point, it should pause and dwell on that point. Then the meditation will produce good movements in the will, such as love of God and neighbor, zeal for the salvation of souls, imitation of Christ, confidence in the goodness and mercy of God. The result of these movements of the affection should be twofold: conversation with God and practical resolutions for the future. Since the purpose of meditation is growth in virtue and the love of God, St. Francis insists the soul should not be satisfied with arousing affections and conversing with God, but should make particular resolutions to put into practice during the day. To all this, says St. Francis, I have added that one should gather a little bouquet of devotion. And this is what I mean. When our mind considers some mystery through meditation, we should select one or two or three points which we have found to be most suitable to our taste, or most helpful to our advancement, in order to recall them during the rest of the day. St. Francis offers counsels concerning the behavior of the individual after meditation is completed. Seek an occasion for putting into practice one's resolution. Remain in silence for a day and then calmly take up the duties of the day. Then, returning to the practice of meditation, St. Francis states that although he has provided a method of procedure, the soul must always yield at once to any holy inspirations and affections aroused in prayer. Holy affections are never to be restrained, but all resolutions should be made only at the end of the meditation. In the third part of the introduction, Francis considers the practice of virtue, selecting those that are particularly necessary for the Christian layman. Of all the virtues treated, we could say that, after charity, the predominantly Salesian virtue is meekness. Thus, St. Francis writes in one of his letters, "Remember the principal lesson, the one which our Lord has left us in 3 words, so that we would never forget it, and which we should repeat 100 times a day. Learn of me, for I am meek and humble in heart." That is all. Just keep your heart meek in regard to your neighbor and humble in regard to God. Finally, in the last 2 parts of the introduction, St. Francis treats of temptations, sadness, consolations, and arity, and concludes the work with a series of self-examinations and considerations whereby the soul can judge its progress in true devotion. Thus, in its totality, the introduction to the devout life provides a complete program for the spiritual advancement of the laity. Whereas the introduction was composed for all Christians of good will, the treatise on the love of God was addressed to a select group. According to Dom Mackey, it also reveals the soul and heart of Francis de Sales at the height of his holiness. The doctrine contained in the treatise was not always esteemed as highly as it should have been, due to the fact that the Jansenists, the Quietists, and Fenelon attempted to make use of the teaching of Francis de Sales in defense of their errors. According to Dom Mackey, even Bossuet did harm to the teachings of St. Francis when he tried to refute the errors of Fenelon. The result was that St. Francis did not enjoy the influence on the French school that he might otherwise have had. The purpose of the treatise is to trace the progress of the soul from its fallen state to the heights of divine love, which constitutes Christian perfection and holiness. St. Francis provides the psychological explanations which are necessary for understanding the theology of love. He then develops the theme of the divine origin of love, showing that man's love for God is a participation in the eternal charity of God himself. And since it is the nature of love to increase or fall away, St. Francis treats of growth in charity, which can be effected when the most insignificant actions, the obstacles to charity, and the various ways in which a soul may abandon divine love for love of creatures. He emphasizes the distinction between love of complacency and love of benevolence, stating that the former is proper to glory, where love is experienced in contemplation and repose, while the latter is proper to the soul in this life. In speaking of mystical prayer and the ecstatic experiences that may accompany it, St. Francis, who constantly expressed the fear of illusion and repugnance for mystical phenomena, seems to be writing of something that he himself had experienced. But the life of charity does not consist exclusively in the delight of mystical power. It is also a question of obedience and suffering. Therefore, Francis discusses the love of conformity, by which the soul obeys the commandments, the counsels and particular inspirations, and the union of our will with the divine will of good pleasure, by which the soul accepts suffering. The treatise ends with a summary of the theology of charity. St. Francis discusses the precepts of love of God and neighbor, charity as the bond and impulse of all the virtues, the gifts and fruit of the Holy Spirit, and precise suggestions for performing one's action as perfectly as possible. From a doctrinal point of view, one of the most insignificant contributions of St. Francis de Sales to spiritual theology was to unify all Christian morality and holiness under the bond of charity. This doctrine, to be sure, had been taught explicitly by St. Thomas Aquinas and other medieval theologians, but by the time of St. Francis de Sales it was necessary to insist again that Christian perfection does not consist in any particular exercise or practice, but in the love of God and neighbor. Few authors have treated of charity and other virtues with greater unction and power of persuasion. Another contribution was the insistence that the perfection of charity and the vocation of all Christians, regardless of their vocation or state in life. Lastly, he explains in detail two exercises that are fundamental to the Christian life: the practice of mental prayer and the cultivation of the virtues proper to one's state in life. St. Francis de Sales may rightly be called the father of modern spirituality, although changing events prevented his influence from being as effective as one would have hoped.